Now we can start today's webinar about the new EU rules on company transparency in Germany and what you need to know to avoid fines. And my name is Nina Poulsen, and I'm head of members and communications here in the German-Danish Chamber of Commerce. And today we are pleased to have Rechtsanwältin Gertrud Hartmann from our partner DanTaxLegal in Germany with us today here from our office in Copenhagen. And before I hand over to Gertrud, I have a couple of practical information. First of all, the webinar will be recorded, and you will get the recording and the presentation afterwards. And during the webinar, you can ask your questions in the chat, and we will take the questions during the webinar or at the end. And Gertrud, you are here with me today. Thank you for being here, and we're looking forward to get the presentation from you about the transparency regulation.
Tak for det. Godmorgen også fra mig. Som Nina har allerede sagt, Gertrud Hartmann. Jeg er advokat fra DanTaxLegal i Hartley, Tyskland. Jeg er specialiseret i international skatteret og erhvervsret, men jeg også beskæftiger mig med udvisningssager, som for eksempel det tyske ejerregister. Derfor arbejder jeg i dette webinar. Desværre min dansk er ikke så godt. Jeg vil fortsætte på engelsk. Det er noget bedste for os alle. All right. So let's proceed in English with the topic I've chosen for today, the German Transparency Register. What's the agenda for today? I would like to talk about the legal framework around the Transparency Register in Germany. I will tell you something about the purpose and objectives, so you get an understanding what's the system around it. I will talk about reporting obligations, sanctions, also the determination of the ultimate beneficial owner. That's always a crucial point in the Transparency Register. I will talk about the scope of documentation, and give you also some practical insights from my work with the Transparency Register. So that you know which room you have to avoid fines. Okay, so let's start with the legal framework. Everything that is related to the German Transparency Register and also to transparency registers in other countries is at the end EU law. It's embedded in a system of anti-money laundering directives and regulations. We have these directives and regulations already since 1991. As I said, it's EU rules, directives, regulations since already 1991. The main rules for especially the Transparency Register was set into force in 2017. That's where this all started. For now, in Germany, we have a national law for that. That's the German Anti-Money Laundering Act, in German called the Geldwäschegesetz, short GWG, GWG. So that's binding for now. As a side note, in 2070, there will be a new EU regulation in force, which will replace all these national acts to avoid national specialities, because now the national states, they have some room to make their own rules on, for example, the Transparency Register, and they want to avoid that. So in 2070 there will be other different legal frameworks, I would say, but at the end the basic system will stay the same. There won't be too much change, just the basic legal framework will be a little different one, and there might also be a few more obligations, but that you will most likely be informed about that later on when it gets relevant. And we will also, of course, maybe write some short text on our LinkedIn pages about that if it gets relevant. Yeah, just that you know, keep your eyes open. So let's proceed with the purpose and objectives of the Transparency Register. Of course, as always in Germany, we have a definition in the law, what it is good for. In paragraph 18, it said collection and disclosure of information on the ultimate beneficial owner of a legal company or entity is the aim of the Transparency Register. One side note about the term disclosure. You might know that we have in Germany also the commercial register, where every legal entity needs to be registered in. And this commercial register, it's open for the public. That's not the case with the Transparency Register. There are only a few specific groups, at least at the moment, who have access to the Transparency Register. You need a purpose to look in there. That's also for data protection reasons. This can be notaries, banks, also attorneys. So they can look into the Transparency Register, but not the broad public. And even if those groups get an extract, they won't see all the information that are stored there. For example, birth dates or place of residence, stuff like this, is not visible for everyone. They can see it, but not all the time. There must be a special purpose to see it all. So that's just about disclosure. Of course, collection and all these storage of information itself, would be a little bit, the question is, what for is it good? And you have to see it in the bigger system of anti-money laundering measurements. The idea is that whenever a legal entity does business, that you can see which natural person stands behind this legal entity and the profits at the end from the deal. Money laundering, probably in the most European states, is put under punishment. So if you gain money from corruption, drug deals, whatever, and want to put it into the legal economic system, that's forbidden. And the Transparency Register should help to detect deals like that. So for example, if someone tries to wash his money through real estate transactions, then the idea is that the notary can check which natural person stands behind this legal entity. And if he discovers, for example, that this natural person comes from a state where we have a higher money laundering risk, then he has higher obligations, I would say, to identify the risk. He needs to look closer to this deal going on. And in the worst case, if he thinks there's money laundering going on, he has to do a report to the so-called Financial Intelligence Unit. That's at the end, it's a website where you put in your report, anonymous. Well, there's an email address from you, so that's also a little bit difficult. But at the end, there is technically an obligation to report if you think there is money laundering going on. The other side of these measurements, or this whole system where the Transparency Register is set in, is the idea to prevent terrorist financing. So you don't just want to know where the money comes from, but also where it goes to, if you have, for example, real estate deals. So, and the Transparency Register collects these information of the natural persons behind a legal entity, and you can look into it if you have a special purpose, as notary, bank, whatever. So that's the purpose and objective. Let's proceed with the reporting obligations. Who needs to put information into the Transparency Register? I think it's probably well known that legal entities under private law and registered partnerships in Germany, so everyone who is registered in the commercial register needs also to be registered in the Transparency Register. I think that's pretty clear, I would say, at least from my experience, everyone knows that. What might be a little bit surprising or not always people know is that also associations based abroad that own real estate in Germany need to be registered. So for example, a Danish company who has real estates in Germany needs also to be registered in the Transparency Register. And that doesn't just apply to owning real estates, but also if you have an obligation to acquire ownership of real estates in Germany, then you're also obliged to register in the Transparency Register. That's something that refers to a speciality in the German law, because we divide between having an obligation to acquire ownership and the transfer of the ownership itself. These are two different legal institutes. That's different in most other European states. But yeah, if you do business in Germany, that rule also applies to you. So I think it's good to know, even if it's different in all the other European states. Another thing about the term real estate, even if that's the term the law uses in Germany, it doesn't just mean buildings, it also means land parcels. That's a weird construction of the law. In paragraph 1, it's then defined that real estate also includes land parcels. So whenever you are owner of land in Germany, then you need to be registered, at least as association. Okay, then it's not just if you are the direct owner of real estates within Germany, but also if you have shares of an association that owns real estates, then you also need to be registered. So that means if you have a group structure and at the front end there is a German limited liability company and you are shareholder of this company, then you also need to be registered, at least if you have around about 90% of those shares. That doesn't apply to every shareholder, but yeah, if you have a high amount of shares, then at least check whether you also need to be registered. That's something I think you need to keep in mind. And the last one, trusts and similar legal arrangements, they are also obliged to register. But yeah, I didn't deal until now with too many of them. The most parts will be association, legal entities under private law. So yeah, that's just a minor group. What happens if you don't register? Yeah, there are sanctions for cases of non-compliance. So there can be an administrative fine starting at 100,000 euros going up to 1 million. That's the one thing that can happen if they discover you are not registered, maybe for a long time. But there's also an institute that's called naming and shaming. There is a list on a website of the Federal Office of Administration, where you can find all the companies who got an administrative fine for not being registered in the Transparency Register. So it's kind of public if you don't comply with the rules. Okay, that about the sanctions. So let's go over to the determination of the ultimate beneficial owner, the natural person who is at the end registered in the Transparency Register for your legal entity, for your company. How do you determine that? The basic principle is that there are two different sorts of ultimate beneficial owner. That's first of all the so-called actual ultimate beneficial owner. That's a person who actually holds shares, for example, at a company. Usually it's on the first layer. If you have just a limited liability company and natural persons as shareholders, then you have to find the one who is more than 25%. That one will be usually the actual ultimate beneficial owner. Usually the shares are the criteria you have to look after, but also special rules, like if you have a veto right or something like this, can also get relevant. So yeah, there are cases that are quite simple, but especially if it comes to group structures, that can also be very difficult to really make sure that the one you put into the Transparency Register is the right person. because from time to time they request the Federal Office of Administration, they request from you proof that this is really the beneficial owner, and then you have to hand in contracts from your company and stuff like that. So you really need to have a close look on that. Sometimes you can't find an actual ultimate beneficial owner because your shares are only 1 to 5% from lots of persons. Then you get to a fictitious beneficial owner. That's, for example, for a limited liability company, the director. Because the idea behind that is that he steers the company then if you have lots of shareholders, for example. So he will be then in the transparency register. I already said, if you have a group structure and lots of layers behind a company, then this can be quite difficult. And you really need to look into the documents you have. Who is really the ultimate beneficial owner? You can find all this also in the law, or you ask someone who can tell you that, or at least look over your determination of the beneficial owner, but make sure it's the right one. Mm-hmm. Yes? Yeah. Do we have a question?
Yeah, we have one question from an NCD. How do they discover that a company is not registered?
Well, I haven't worked yet in the Federal Office of Administration, but there is a technical connection between the commercial register and the transparency register, and I think they screen that. Who is registered in the commercial register and who is in the transparency register. They do this from time to time, and if you're lucky, you get a letter and they say, hey, you are not registered in the transparency register, please do that until this date of time. So I will explain this later, but for example, the name of the company and the address, that gets the transparency register of the commercial register. So if that changes in the German commercial register, you don't need to change that in the transparency register as well. Because if you look into the transparency register, you just see this firm company does already exist in the commercial register. But that's where they discover that. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think a short comment is that I assume it's not working.
Okay. Sometimes it's not working. I had some cases in the past time where they did get this letter, hey, you are not registered, please do. But of course, I also have cases where they didn't realize it until now. So sometimes you're lucky, sometimes not. So I would say that's just administration, depending on the one who is responsible for you in the federal office, probably. Any more questions?
The same person just writes, I was not allowed to report a missing company.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, I will talk also about that because I think you're referring to the discrepancy report. There is now a special form also for this. I don't know, maybe you need to elaborate. I assume that they answered you or told you maybe why. That would be interesting for me to know what they said there. But usually, for example, notaries, they are also at the end obliged to report if someone is missing, if there is a mistake or something like that. I'm not sure whether a normal person who hasn't these obligations to check whether there are money laundering issues going on is allowed to do this discrepancy report. But the notary is in any case. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that was all.
Okay. All right. Then I would proceed with the scope of documentation. First of all, the transparency register was set in place at October 1st, 2017. And whatever is related to your company, all the beneficial owners need to be registered in a chronological order. That means if you are not registered yet, but your company was set up before 2017, then you need to register all the ultimate beneficial owners since that. So if you had, I don't know, 10 changes of your director, this can be very time intensive and also cost intensive if you need to do it now. But yeah, well, you can try just to register the last one, but they will most likely ask you what was before, I don't know, 2024, if you registered from that period on. So yeah, that's, I think, important to know, that it needs to be the chronological order since 2017. There's also, of course, an obligation to update. So if you're, for example, director as fictional ultimate beneficial owner changes in the commercial register in Germany, then keep in mind you need also to change the transparency register entry. Also, if you have restructuring in your group structure, if shares changes, then also keep in mind that your ultimate beneficial owner might change, and at least check on that. Now we come something that is related, or I already said. The company data is also, of course, documented in the transparency register, meaning the name of the firm and the address. And as I already said, it's connected to the commercial register. So if something changes in the commercial register, it will also change in the transparency register. But keep in mind that only applies if it's an actual company registered in the commercial register. If you're an association from Denmark who only is registered in the transparency register because you have real estate ownership here, then of course no one knows if your company name changes. So you need to do this on your own. And one side note, not only the commercial register is connected to the transparency register, there's also a connection between the so-called land parcel register. So we have a register where every land parcel is in, and you can see who is the owner and who has specific rights for that land, is allowed to use it in a certain way. This register is also connected to the transparency register. And if you are registered in this land parcel register as association from abroad, then it is connected to your data from the transparency register. Also, this connection, not all the people can see it, but notaries, I think, they can see, for example, who has which ownership in Germany. Just that you know that this is also connected. About the recorded information on the ultimate beneficial owner, what's stored is last name, first name, date of birth, place of residence, country of residence, and nationality. From a practical side, if you put this into the transparency register, make sure that it complies with the passport. Don't forget second names or stuff like that. Of course, they don't ask usually at the first registration about the passport, but sometimes if, for example, there's a discrepancy report, they will after that ask for your passport. And if it's not right, then you need to make changes. It takes time and maybe also money. So make sure if you put the entry into the register that it is the same how it is in the passport. Why country of residence, nationality? I already said if a notary does real estate transaction, he is obliged to check on the money laundering risk, and if he discovers, he will check also on the nationality of the natural person behind a legal entity, and if he discovers that this person comes from a country that is on a legally defined list of states where we assume a higher money laundering risk, then he needs to look closer to this deal and has higher obligations to check. So that's where the nationality and the country of residence is important for.
Yeah, just one question. When register the first time, there's no passport as a request for a passport documentation.
Usually, yeah, that's the case. If you go on the website, they will just ask you who is your beneficial owner for what period of time that you put in, and that's it. And if you're lucky, they just approve your entry there. But sometimes you also get an email back, and they will ask for the passport. Or I don't know, I also had cases where kind of randomly you suddenly get a letter and they ask for proof that your the name is right in the transparency register. So I don't know what the process is on that, how they choose the persons, where they check closer. I think they screen it somehow and maybe also combine it with information they get from other points. But yeah, usually if you do the first registration, they won't ask you for a passport.
Yeah, and someone else asked, in July 27, we need to get birth city too. Will they need that too?
Sorry, I didn't get it.
Birth city, but I think you mentioned that from as a
Birth.
place of birth.
Well, no, they birth city. That's interesting. Okay, because usually you have the date of birth that's registered and your place of residence, but your place of birth, that sounds strange to me. But well, if they ask for it, then I only can advise to. Well, yeah, I probably would ask back, why do you need my place of birth if it doesn't come up on the extract from the transparency register? Yeah, but that's interesting. I hope.
Yeah,
Another
that
question?
was all, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's the scope of documentation. Yeah, so practical insights. I have a few more things I just want to point out because, yeah, they come up from time to time when I work with the transparency register. The first thing is that the law says that every company is obliged to keep an internal documentation of their ultimate beneficial owner. So my advice is just, if you make changes to the transparency register, you usually get, either you do it on your own or a lawyer does it for you or someone else. Keep this extract about the change in your internal documentation, and also make sure if you have different changes that you can prove these different changes chronologically, in best case with extracts from the transparency register, and also keep some sort, if you're a group, keep some sort of group structure over this whole time period, so that if they ask why is this person now the beneficial owner or back then this one, that they can see it, or yeah, see in the group structure why. So that's, yeah, just an advice, the extract and the group structure, because, and if someone needs to register a new person in the transparency register, they will also ask for a group structure to determine the actual ultimate beneficial owner. So I think it makes sense overall, and you probably have that, but yeah, because sometimes I get questions why we develop a group structure if people don't have it by now. Okay, that's the one thing. The other thing is the discrepancy report, Unstimmigkeitsmeldung. We also talked about that. If a notary does real estate transactions, then he has to pull a transparency register extract and has to check whether the beneficial owner you told him and the ultimate beneficial owner registered in the transparency register are the same. And if he realizes, oh, there's a mistake, then he has to report this to the Federal Office of Administration. Yeah, so it's not just a notary, it can also be a bank, but that's where it comes from. And then you get a letter from the transparency register, and they will ask, or tell you to prove that the person registered is the beneficial owner, or ask you to change something. Maybe one thing there is usually a date until you have to do this, and you sometimes also get login data, and make sure that you do this before the date runs out, because after that you won't be able to use these login data anymore, and then it gets complicated. So yeah, keep that in mind. The discrepancy report is not what I told about the support of the notary. If he thinks that money laundering is going on, that's something different. And I would say discrepancy report, that's nothing you need to get a heartbeat on. Just make sure that you give them the information they need, and then it's fine. The last thing, there's also a possibility to do corrections in the transparency register. If you realize maybe, oh, we registered the wrong date of birth for a person, then that's not such a bad thing. You can correct it. The only thing is you see on a transparency register extract whether there have been corrections been made in a certain period of time. And I also forgot to mention, in case of a discrepancy report, this is also shown in the transparency register extract, that there is that they check on that the check on discrepancies going on. It's then called laufende or ongoing check on paragraph 23a of the German Geldwäschegesetz. So it's shown, and it's also shown if it's resolved. That's always the problem with this discrepancy reports, that you see that there was something going on. I don't know whether this has impact on transactions you want to make as a company, but technically your transparency register extract is not white or blank anymore. So yeah, that's the case with these two things. I just wanted to mention, because these are practical things that I have on my table very often. And yeah, I think that's it from my side now. And I would be open to questions if you have some more.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'll just check if someone is writing, but you have enlightened us with a lot of questions, with a lot of things about this and information. We have one question here. Just in the material overview of the AML package, it is explicitly stated that going forward, companies must have more detailed knowledge of the customer, including place of birth, nationality, refugee status, and place of residence.
Where is this AML package coming from, or who's providing it? The EU. Yeah. Well, you have to. It's a different, or what I do in my when I work is the registration at the transparency register. That's, I think, one thing as company what you need to register there, and of course it's a way bigger topic if you talk about obligations to make sure that no money laundering is going on if you do deals. That's a way bigger topic, and of course refugee status, place of residence and stuff like this. A lot more data may play a role to make sure that no money laundering is going on. But for the registration and transparency register itself, the refugee status, it doesn't appear on the transparency register extract. I can't remember that the register did ever ask me for a refugee status of a person. That's at least not in the register. Of course, there might be persons who are obliged to check it, but that's a different question, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then someone is asking.
Good question. This extract.
The question is, can you only get an extract from the register through a notary?
No. There are lots of persons. You can get it through an attorney, and of course a notary also gets it. But usually the companies itself should also be able to register in the Transparency Register and get some extracts. I think it's also in Denmark. Okay, it's behind a paywall now, but usually the company or the director of a company should be able to register there. Lawyers, attorneys should be able to get this extract. A notary, of course, banks. The question is probably at the end, especially with a notary or a bank, whether they will provide it to you just like that, because technically they get this extract to do their anti-money laundering check and not to give it to you. But yeah, so if the question is not that only the notary, no, there are other persons who can also get it.
Yeah. I think that was all. If you have any more questions, you can ask them now, and otherwise we'll get to the end of your presentation. It was a pleasure to have you with us for this webinar, and you have taken us through a lot of different things about regulations and documentation, and I also think the practical insights are very important, because you work with this every day, and also know what is important and what is perhaps important but isn't stated anywhere, but just have to know that it's important. So thank you very much for your information also about that.